All right, behave yourselves. You're being recorded. So, for the record, I'm Dawn Jordan. I'm a professor of planning at Texas A&M University, where I serve as the Executive Associate Dean for the College of Architecture. I'd like to introduce you formally to my colleague, Dr. Sheri Smith, who's Director of Planning at Texas Southern University. Together, we envision this panel with our colleagues on the Committee on the Academy, entitled Leading During the Confluence of Crises. To say that it's been a year would be an absolute understatement. All of our guests are deans and provosts who either are planners or represent colleges with planning programs. Some were even very new to their positions at the start of this pandemic/syndemic. Please allow me to introduce our guest. We're joined by Dean Susan Gooden. Susan is the Dean and Professor of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. She is an internationally recognized expert on social equity. Her books include Global Equity in Administration, Why Research Methods Matter, Race and Social Equity, A Nervous Area of Government, and Cultural Competency for Public Administrators. Our next guest is Dean Kevin Hamilton. Kevin is Dean of the College of Fine Arts and Applied Arts at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He is also a professor of new media in the School of Art and Design. He holds appointments in media and cinema studies in the College of Media. His recent research includes the role of photography in nuclear weapons research and culminated in his book with Ned O'Gorman, Look Out America, the secret Hollywood studio at the heart of the Cold War. And finally, Dr. Jim Spencer. He is Vice Provost and Dean and Professor in the School of Architecture at the Louisiana State University. He previously was Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies in the College of Architecture at Clemson University. Dr. Spencer's research focuses on international urbanization and planning issues, with a focus on water supplies, infrastructure, and inequality. His 2014 book, entitled Global Urbanization, the Global Urban Ecosystem, is part of the Rowan and Littlefield series on globalization. We're excited to bring these guests together tonight. Some logistics for our session. Each of our guests will share their leadership experiences over the course of the next 45 minutes. We invite you to place any questions that you have in the chat. At the conclusion of their remarks, Dr. Smith will engage our panelists in some question and answers, after which we're going to move you as groups into breakout rooms and give you the opportunity to join an individual breakout room with one of our guests so that you can have more detailed conversations about some of the things that they've said. You will be able to rotate between the breakout rooms with our speakers. Dr. Smith will give you some more guidance on how to do that later on in our session. I'd like to begin by inviting Susan Gooden to offer us her remarks.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some of my thoughts. And when I received some of the questions for us to think about, and as I was going through these, it was really sort of a cathartic experience because it allowed me to reflect back, particularly on the last year, and to be able to share some of those experiences. And although I am not a planner, as Dawn mentioned, we do have urban and regional planning in the Wilder School, and everything that I'm saying can be fact checked by my colleague, Professor Jimmy Chin, who I know is here as well. So he'll help keep me honest in this, but I appreciate this opportunity. So let me start by just painting the stage a little bit. What I think was really interesting for me is that I was very new to the role. So even though I've been at the Wilder School since 2004, and I was interim dean for 2 years prior to, so for 8 academic years, 18-19 and 19-20, I was interim dean. And interestingly enough, they invited in 4 candidates to interview for the position of dean. 2 of us interviewed on campus prior to spring break, and the other two were supposed to interview after spring break. So, of course, as the internal candidate, you always interview first. And so I interviewed first, another external candidate interviewed. And then over spring break is when everything, of course, just really turned very different. And so we didn't end up coming back from spring break. And so the other two candidates interviewed virtually. So I really didn't even know what was going to go on with the search at that time, or whether they're going to suspend it, keep it, so it was really sort of an interesting leadership position to be in. But I knew regardless whether I was selected for the position or not, that I had an important responsibility because I was at the helm of the Wilder School at the time. And I wanted to either try to situate the Wilder School for success if we were going to have a leadership transition, or to try to put things into place that would allow us to be successful, where I had to have been selected for the position. So in April of 2020, I was named the dean of the Wilder School, and I was really happy about that, not just for myself personally, but I really did not I thought to do a leadership change now at this point would really not be good for anyone in the school. And so, although just about everything that I had presented on a month before about, what I thought I would be doing my first year and all of that, I mean, that completely had gone out the window, of course, because of COVID and the coronavirus. So I found myself being in a very different leadership position than I thought I was going to be when I interviewed for the position just a month before I was named dean. So that was interesting. I thought I would situate my comments around things that I think we did well, things that we took a pass on in terms of some priorities that we didn't do. I know that was one of the questions. And then also, just speaking honestly, some things that I think we didn't do as well on. So I'll start on a positive note, what I think we did well. One of the things that we did, and I have to thank our IT person for this, is when we first began to hear that we might be teleworking for a few weeks at the time, is what we thought. My IT director said, "Hey, why don't we do a practice telework day?" And so I said, "Okay, let's do it." So we did a practice telework day, probably about a week and a half before we actually went into full-blown teleworking. And that was great because we learned a lot just from that one day in terms of people's internet connections, computer issues. That gave us a head start because we were already able to order the things that we needed and to make the accommodations we needed for our staff, this primarily impacted staff, so that they could execute on their positions. And, just finding out some of the things in terms of, people not having broadband access in their homes. They were really just, or not having, really sort of using at home their telephones, smartphones. And so really that gave us a sense of what were our needs in order to support our staff. Not so much for faculty, because of course faculty were working from home a lot anyway, but we found out a lot of things in terms of how we could support our staff there. And we were able to get some things ordered before kind of the mad rush came. So I was glad that I listened. And that was something that I think that helped us well. The other thing that I immediately put into place was a communications plan. I didn't know what the information was going to be. I knew that VCU Central University, they were starting to put out updates, but I knew that people were going to want to know what's going on in terms of the Wilder School. So almost immediately, I started something called the communique that went out at first every day. And it just had updates about transitioning courses remotely, what was happening in terms of telework. I mean, just all kinds of information, any information that we thought people would need, that went out every morning because things were happening. And I could immediately see that if not, we were going to have a whole bunch of emails just going around, floating around, and no real synthesis to that. So we said, hey, if you have information, rather than putting it on the listserv, please send it to the communique. We'll post it, and every morning it'll go out. And so I think people knew in the Wilder School to look in the communique to see what was going on. And I think that helped give us a good organizational structure. And then, and one of those, on Wednesday, we had what was called Wellness Wednesday. So we always had a part in the communique from the beginning on Wednesdays, something that talked about wellness, taking care of yourself, making time for family, just, the plethora of things that were coming up, managing kids and working from home and just a lot of things there. We also, I also tried to meet with faculty in small groups and to meet with staff in small groups to go around, because we were having these big meetings. We had the communique that was going out, but that's one-way communication. And I really tried to, through Zoom, talk to folks in small groups and just get a sense of, how things were going, what they needed, and to be able to listen to what their concerns were. So we really tried to ramp up our communications efforts. One thing that I noticed that was interesting from the beginning is that when we started having our meetings, more people showed up for the virtual meetings than they did normally when they were on campus. And so that was something, because we had folks that normally do not show up at our all personnel meetings. They might be out training or, for whatever reason. And so we saw that we had a higher attendance rate. And I said, well, this is good in terms of people being engaged and getting the information. So I think people were hungry for information. We also did something that we continue to have, and I should say the communique has now gone down to 2 days a week. So it comes out on Mondays and Wednesdays. We did a survey and decided to cut it back to Mondays and Wednesdays, but it's still, I think, a great informational tool about what's going on in the school. And then we started once a month TGIF. Thank God it's Fridays. It would be a Friday in the month, one Friday in the month at 3 o'clock. And it was a way for people just to connect socially. We didn't, it was upbeat. We did some really fun things. One of the things we did over when it was close to Halloween, folks dressed up in costumes. Our associate dean, hands down, was fantastic. She dressed up as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she was just, it was a lot of fun. So we've done a lot of fun things through TGIF. One of our conferences, we had a number of individuals who were due to receive awards, and it was going to be in Disneyland in California. And so we had a Disney themed TGIF where we recognized them, and everybody showed up with, something from Disney that they could find in their homes. So that was fun as well. And then I think my personal favorite was actually the one at the end of the year, where our communications team put together a musical sort of PowerPoint presentation of the year in review. And when we saw the things that had happened in January and February before the pandemic, they seemed like they happened 5 or 10 years ago. It just seemed so long ago. And so to see the year in review and to see what we were doing in January and February compared to, after March, April, May, it was just, so it was a nice, I think, year in review and an opportunity for us to reflect. So those are some of the things that I think went well for us. I will also say that one of the things that we did, because we know this has been a very tumultuous year, is after the George Floyd murder, we came together and developed a racial equity action plan. And that's something that continues to guide our work. We had faculty, we had staff, we had students engaged in this work over the summer, which I was amazed to see. We had about 35 people who said, yes, I want to be involved with this. And so the entire plan is on our website, but we have it in 5 different areas. We had cabinet level priorities for the dean's office. We had student support, teaching and curriculum, research and scholarship, and community and alumni engagement. And so one of the things we did, for example, was have our doctoral lecture series all focused on racial equity. So everyone we were inviting in for the series this year had a focus on racial equity in their work, whether they were from urban and regional planning or homeland security and emergency preparedness or criminal justice, whichever field they were in within the Wilder School, that was thematic there. And so we've done a lot of work in this area. I'm happy to go into more detail there, but I think the Racial Equity Action Plan, because I was particularly concerned that with the pandemic that was going on, and then everything that was happening to our faculty of color and the experiences they were having, and it's also being disproportionately harder hit by the pandemic, we wanted to make sure we sent a clear message in terms of our Wilder School values, which we are concerned about social equity and social justice, thinking about our namesake, Governor Wilder. We wanted to make sure that we tried to take seriously the challenges that were before us. And so that's a plan that is operational and that we continue to make progress on and to evaluate and assess our progress. And then the other thing I will say is the community connection. I think we really strengthened our connection to the community. VCU has always had a strong connection to Richmond and to the Virginia community, particularly through state agencies. But we had a number of our faculty. We've never had that town and gown piece. That's never been a part of not just the Wilder School, but Virginia Commonwealth University. So we had our faculty members, like our urban regional planning faculty, Ben Teresa and Kate Howell, the RVA eviction lab. Of course, there were a lot of issues around housing and eviction. They stepped up to the plate. They really made their information accessible. They were given interviews. So their work was and continues to be held in high regard. But more importantly, it provided information that was useful to policymakers who were thinking about and grappling with these issues. We have a project that we're working on now with the Virginia Department of Emergency Management that I'm working with, looking at equity and vaccine allocation. And so we proposed a relative vaccination rate that has now been incorporated into the state's allocation strategy for vaccinations. So there were just a lot of really applied hands-on work. And because we already had these relationships, these strong relationships in place within the Richmond community and the state of Virginia, we didn't have to, as our Homeland Security people always tell us, during an emergency, that's not the time to be passing out business cards. At that point, you're relying on the relationships that you already have in place. And I think what we found out in the Wilder School was really truly appreciating how strong relationships we did have with the Richmond community, with state policymakers, that they did turn to us, and we were very eager to see how could we assist on many, many fronts. And so that was helpful. And then we also started a virtual alumni lunch and learn series that happened once a month, where we had, and I think this was great because, quite frankly, in terms of in-person events, we normally only engage alumni if they come to the Richmond area, or we happen to be at a conference somewhere offsite, and we might invite alumni to a reception or a breakfast or something like that. Or I'm going out, or my development director is going out and meeting with our alumni. But we didn't do a lot to reach out to our alumni through Zoom sessions and virtual opportunities. We've done that, and our monthly Lunch and Learn series it's brought in alumni from all over and strengthened their connection to the Wilder School. So we've been very excited about being able to engage with them. And some of these things we think, why didn't we do this before? So these are some of the things that I think we will keep after the pandemic. But of course, everything wasn't rosy. We had our stumbles as well. Part of our challenge was deciding what is it that we're going to participate in, and what are some things we're going to take a pass on. And one university priority that we decided to pass on right before winter break on December 4th, our president met with all the deans and said, we're concerned about enrollment for January. Of course, we already had a concern about enrollment for the fall, and they were thinking about, retention and fall of 2020. We actually did pretty well with that because we started recruiting in the summer, and that was very helpful. But there was a concern about spring enrollment. And so there were these new initiatives that rolled out that we could do mini semesters, whereby students could take in this current semester, the spring 2021 semester, they could take mini courses, 6-week courses or 8-week courses. And we met on December 4th. That's when we had the meeting with President Rao on December 4th. And I thought, there is no way we are getting ready to go into winter break. I just cannot ask my faculty, ask our student advisors to say, hey, let's develop some mini semester courses, and let's advise students over the winter break and early in. Everybody was just happy to get to winter break. And so as a school, we decided not to do that. And although I consulted the faculty on it, I had largely said, unless there's a big pushback from this wasn't something that we were going to do. And I think that our faculty appreciated that. I know that our student services and our academic advisors appreciated that. But of course, it's hard because you have a university initiative and you want to be a team player. but we just simply didn't feel like we could say yes because we didn't think we would execute on it well. And didn't have enough time to prepare, and that frankly, people were just burnt out. And we had to recognize that this was an opportunity for people to take a pause. So we didn't do it then. I think we will do some of those in the fall because I did say at the time, hey, we'll revisit that for the fall. But that was something that we said, no, we're going to have to take a hard pass on this. And then some things that didn't go well. So some of the things that didn't go well, I think really all go back to missing those informal relationships. Zoom is great, and there are some advantages there, but as we all know, there are many disadvantages as well. I feel like I don't have the same level of awareness of what faculty are working on in terms of their research or just the ideas that they're thinking about. You would see somebody in the hall, or maybe we'd have, a brown bag, people would share ideas, and, people were doing their own thing and doing that well. But I just didn't feel like I have a sense of new ideas that people are thinking about, or changes that they're making to their classes, just a lot of those informal conversations. And so you feel like that there's more of a tactical, I guess, connection to folks because you're getting on a Zoom meeting for a particular reason, rather than sort of that informal information and that collegial information that we all want to know and to support each other on. Another area is how well we integrated our new people. I still struggle with this. We've hired some people during the pandemic. Some were administrative folks, but we had already made offers, of course, for the beginning of the 2020 academic year in the fall. And we had already hired those people in the spring, 3 faculty members. We brought them on in the fall. And, fortunately, we did meet them for their interviews because they happened before we shut down. But, just onboarding 3 new assistant professors, my heart goes out, and I think I feel like we've tried to make that connection. But, I just don't know how well we've integrated all of our new folks, whether they're faculty or whether they're a new advisor. I just feel like, they don't know us as well, and we don't know them as well as the folks who have been around. So that's something that I struggle with. And then connecting nationally. That's something that's a high importance for me. I actually had an opportunity when I was interim dean to attend the last ACSP meeting in Minneapolis. And so building out those professional connections, whether it's through my own home discipline of public administration, I just, no offense to any of the virtual conferences. I know everyone is doing a great job, but I just think there's no good replacement for those opportunities to grab a coffee or to take a walk with a colleague at a conference. And so I miss that very much. And I think being able to connect nationally with people and just, have informal conversation is something that we haven't done well. And that's something that I'm looking forward to being able to resolve, hopefully, within the next year. And so then I was asked to comment on sort of what was my operating principle. And I've reflected on this, and I really think that authenticity was really my operating principle. I tried to be as transparent as I could possibly be with information that I had to reach out to people and try to understand that everyone was being impacted by the coronavirus, and some were being impacted much more heavily than others. So I knew that people had family that they were caring about. We're all part of some sort of unit, whether it's a biological family or a friend's family, and so I think my principle has been really trying to be authentic, to demonstrate that I understand and that I care about the challenges that people have faced, and to try to let them know that even though we are connected by our connection to the Wilder School and also to Virginia Commonwealth University, that most importantly, we're connected to each other as humans, as individuals, and as part of a larger professional family. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to take questions at the appropriate time. But that's a little bit of a tour about what the last year has been like in the Wilder School. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to jump in. Thank you, Dr. Gooden. We will hear from our next speaker, which will be, I'm hoping Don jumps on. I'm going to jump in, Dr. Spencer.
I'll talk about, kind of that we were asked to sort of talk about how we prioritize things when we make decisions in administrative and leadership positions. And what I want to do is I want to tell a story of 3 basic crises, because this is, as Dawn and others were saying, this has really been a unique year in terms of drama and crisis and having to do things that we don't normally do. But I will make a couple of general comments before talking about what I kind of learned and some of the experiences in each of them. First off, I think, it's been said already, I think pre-existing values, and this is the strength of planning, is that we think about values, not just of the academy, but our values outside of the academy and our work we do and how they work with communities and how they impact communities. It's thinking about those pre-existing values and finding others in crisis that share those values, because those are your primary team members. They may be your boss, they may be somebody who reports to you, they may be somebody in a completely different department, but they're people who are going to help sort of center you on the things that really you need to be focusing on based on what you believe. Similar to this, I think. And I'll get to sort of how this has kind of come to a crisis point in recent days, is as an administrator and an academic leader, we are always taught to sort of, be quiet, step back, don't react. And that's good. But it doesn't necessarily need to translate into being diplomatic for diplomacy's sake. And that's something that I think is really important and related to the values question. At the end of the day, if you're in an administrative position, whether it's a department chair or a dean or a provost or president or whatever, you are, as George Bush and Bill Clinton used to say, the decider in chief, or I think it was Barack Obama who agreed with Bill or with George Bush, is that there's one thing they agree on: your job is to make decisions and to live by those decisions. And that's not a diplomatic thing. The diplomatic part is helping people understand that decision. And that's where it comes in. But the decision is not diplomatic. The decision is a decision. And that's important to recognize, I think, because that embodies your values. That's something that's important, not just for you, but for how you're actually communicating through actions to your constituencies. And because of that, it can be kind of a lonely business in some ways, and not terribly lonely, but you oftentimes find yourself out alone on a stance, because it's not, it either needs to be said and it'll get overridden, and that's okay. Or it's something you need to kind of get different parts of an organization to conform to, because that's something that just needs to get done. And because of that, it's okay to be ostracized a bit for a little while. And I say this as, I'll give you a little bit about a background, because Dawn was asking me in some of our earlier notes to sort of point out that in some ways I'm a planner outside of the planning world. And in order to get some of the background, I started off at the University of Hawaii with my primary appointment in political science. And that was the largest undergraduate major on campus in the University of Hawaii system, right? So dealing with a lot of sort of general social science undergraduates was half of what I was doing. And then when I moved to Clemson for the past seven and a half years, I was chair of a department that was centered on planning, but it had a couple of other disciplines there as well. But then I became an associate dean for research and graduate studies in the second largest college on campus, which was the College of Architecture, Arts, and Humanities. And we taught, I think, 60% of the credit hours on campus at the undergraduate level. So yes, I had deployed planning skills in those contexts, but it wasn't sort of in a planning community. And now it's even more sort of separate from the planning community, but important as the planning skills that I'm able to employ in that as vice provost and dean of the graduate school for 6,000 plus graduate students. So, nobody really shares the values that planners have, though they may sort of touch on some of the same things. So you kind of have to herd a whole range of different types of perspectives. And that becomes a skill set that the planner has is very important. So the positions that I've been in have been very non-traditional planning kind of administrative positions, but it's the skills of the planner that I think are very useful in adding value to those situations. So with that, let me tell you some of the issues that came up. The first crisis, right? So March 2020, about a year ago, pandemic. Some people saw it coming, some people it was out of the blue, but I remember we got a notification from the president while I was at Clemson. Make sure when the students go away for spring break that they bring all their books that they're going to need for the rest of the semester, because they might not come back. And so, of course, we all knew like nobody's coming back. Now, one of the things that was the challenge at that time was explaining to 300 plus faculty what was going on, right? Because it was nobody's experience, that nobody knew anything. And it wasn't even that nobody knew anything about what we were doing. It was that for people who were science-based, even in the humanities, they're sort of, they're looking at the studies that are done. They're looking at, what is the, New York Times saying? What is the, Anthony Fauci saying? What are all these kind of trusted sources saying? And there was no information. There's no good information coming from anywhere. Not because people weren't trying, but because nobody knew anything, right? So if you remember, we were obsessively cleaning our desks with alcohol because that was seen to be sort of the primary transmission for the virus. Now, it's not to say that we shouldn't have been doing that, but in retrospect, 10 months later, nobody's doing that. That's not seen to be sort of the primary route of transmission. And why I point that out is because even though it is in the crisis moment and you have to make decisions, right? We had to send students home. That was a decision that just we made and we had to stick by it. And we had to set up protocols that if somebody who had been exposed to the virus was in a building, we had to close down the building and spend the day cleaning it out and wait 48 hours, right? Now that was in response to, this actually happened, and I had to kind of call somebody in the middle of the night to sort of notify them. A faculty member who had been in a household who somebody had suspected of COVID was, picking up a book that they had forgotten when they evacuated from the building. Well, that got out and it was a possibility, right? So we had to close it down. Now, explaining that if the issue was tuberculosis, you would be able to say, yeah, we know this much about the disease. We know, what the consequences are of not doing this. To say it with a disease that nobody knew anything about, but everybody was worried about, is a very different prospect. So all that to say is that in the absence of information, I think the important thing is to be clear and decisive, but also know what you don't know, right? And don't overly compensate for lack of knowledge by saying, we know that you're going to get sick, and communicate risk, because when you're talking with a population like a university population, they're very critical. They know, like, they think about things a lot, and they'll kind of know the broader situation. And the prior speaker was talking about authenticity, and that's one of the components here, is knowing what you don't know and communicating that in ways that still enable people to sort of follow what you need them to do according to new protocols that they're unfamiliar with. Another thing that I will say is that, in that time, we had a lot of study abroad students at the undergraduate level. I think we had 100 students in Italy before it was coming. So we had to get them back home, right? We had to get them back home immediately. And so the first question that comes up, who's paying, right? who's paying for my change of flight and the lost value of the board that I was getting in at the facility in Italy and all this kind of stuff. In those kinds of situations, just pay for it and figure it out later. It's not worth trying to nickel and dime people. And even if it doesn't turn out to be a crisis, I think it's the money factors are never as important as both the health factors, but also the reputation of how you related to them in crisis. And that's something that I'll say a little bit more about, because to me, what that crisis really showed was it wasn't, nobody knew really what to do, but they knew how you talk to them when you ask them to do things. And that's the thing that people will remember, and they'll understand. Yes, you had to make a difficult decision. but you did it in a way that treated me with respect, that treated me with as a conscious human being that can sort of needs to understand something and can understand something. One other thing that I will say about that crisis of the pandemic, I say two things. One is I was the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies, and one of the interesting phenomena was that people wanted to help, right? Our scholars and active researchers, they wanted to do something. So we had a whole bunch of architects that really wanted to self-organize and print masks or face shields, right? Because they had a whole bunch of 3D printers and they figured they could print out X number that they could deliver to the hospitals. And so part of the challenge as administrator was to kind of figure out how they could sort of work within the rules and get decisions very quickly so that they could kind of deploy their interests and their skill sets and in what they were doing on other things in a way that was contributing to kind of dealing with the crisis itself. Now, I won't say that they had a huge impact. I think that there were other things that were challenges for them, but at least giving them the sense that they were contributing to our community in the process of kind of doing what they did in a general sense was really important for building a level of trust and building a sense of shared burden. The other thing that with the pandemic that is currently going on is, in my current position, is advocating for graduate students, right? I mean, this is something that in many cases, they get lost. They get left out. A lot of our universities, they love the undergraduates. That's where their tuition comes. That's where the parents get on the phone and call people and complain. But the graduate students, they're in front of the classes and they don't have the right to say, I'm going to teach online. And you try and fire me if you tell me to go and teach in front of a class, right? Our faculty, even the assistant profs, are protected in that way that the graduate students generally are not. And they're teaching very large classes because disproportionately they're intro classes, but they're exposed more. And so one of the things that I think was really important is when it was brought to my attention that this was a concern by one of the deans, was really sort of getting them on a list of priority for vaccines, right? And we have our president and our provost who are kind of working with the governor to kind of get faculty and staff in the stage 2 vaccine priority, but nobody was thinking about the graduate students, right? But when you think about it, they were exposed. So we needed to get them on the list. I'm happy to say that we were able to get them on that list so that they'll be treated just like faculty when the vaccines do cut down to our level. But it's sort of thinking about who is not really served under the conventional kind of structure. And that as a graduate dean, that is my constituency in large part. Okay, I'll move over and try to move quickly on this. May 2020, I think it was, George Floyd murder, obviously a very traumatic time. I don't think anybody was surprised by it, though the reaction to it, there might have been some surprise. If I were to say that the pandemic was sort of managing logistics in large part about kind of like where do we go, what do we do, how do we behave? I would say that the George Floyd murder and the months after that really were emotional management. And that's something that I think we don't tend to value enough. We tend to sort of think about, okay, fix this problem, especially as planners, right? We are taught to be very practical and deploy our skills to solve problems, which is great. But in that kind of situation, what's the problem we're going to solve? Like tremendous sadness, fear, depression, just loss of faith. Those are not things that we can solve, right? Those are things that we need to figure out how to relate to people, figure out how to give them a little bit of hope, figure out how to give them an ear, and also give people quiet, right? Sometimes if we try and solve too many problems in short order, it's actually more stressful than just sort of saying, okay, let's, I'm here if you want to talk to me or whatever it is. Now that plays out amidst a much longer conversation. We all know that these, police brutality and killings and this kind of stuff is not, limited to May 2020. It's an ongoing problem. And there are also, many faculty and students and staff who are concerned with this kind of stuff in general. And especially, at Clemson, one of the somewhat unique things about Clemson is it was built on a slave plantation, and donated by a plantation owner who's who is the namesake of the university. And it is what it is, but it's been an ongoing conversation. What the moment of spring 2020 did was it gave people who had been working on these issues for years the opportunity to be in the spotlight and to really be heard. And that's one of those things where, one, the job of the administrator is really to sort of identify, figure out if that person or that group of people wants to speak out about something or to share what they know. And if they do, figure out how to make it happen. And fortunately, at the time, we were undergoing kind of a series of focus groups. And this is where the planner skill set deployed within the College of Humanities is fairly unique. Like we said, let's do a series of focus groups on race and equity and at Clemson and what we can do. This is back in the summer of 2019. The history folks and the English folks who are the dominant, like, what's a focus group? How do you do that, right? And it was just not in the skill set. And so that's one of those things where if, as a planner, and I just happened to have that skill set, just organizing it so that the conversation could happen and people could then have the conversation, and managing it in a certain way and then documenting in a certain way helped in ways that wouldn't have been there if I hadn't brought that planning skill set to the table, right? I think it would have evolved in a very different way. But those things are always ongoing, and these kinds of moments where there isn't kind of a need for emotional stability and hope is to find people who know something, and find people who have a perspective that needs to be shared and could be shared in this perspective usefully for other people. One thing I will say, coming back to the authenticity comment that came up earlier, is this is my own opinion. I would not field test your responses to these kinds of questions. And this is something where I critique some of the people that I worked with, is that, they were sort of sending around notes to, say, is it okay to say this? Is it okay to say that? And da-da-da. And I get it. I understand that there's, nobody wants to kind of step on toes that they don't want to step on. And they don't want to hurt people that they don't mean to hurt. On the other hand, I think it's really important as a leader and somebody who people look up to or look to for stability, is able to have the confidence to speak and communicate on their own, and to say, this is how I feel about it. And this is how I came to that feeling about it. And that's me. That's not the person I asked over here. That's not the person. Of course, I know them and I talk about things with them on other issues, and I generate, sort of opinions in concert with them. But if I'm your decider in chief, or if you are my decider in chief, I want to know what you think. I don't want to know that you need to field test everything when you need to respond to a very emotional situation. And that's, and you will make mistakes, right? Most people will make mistakes in that, but somebody who can own those mistakes, adapt to the response that they get from that in a creative way, in a constructive way. I think that's really important. And that's what I mean. Part of emotional management of a community is establishing your position there, because if you want to be the decider in chief, if you want to be that leader, you have to take responsibility for it, right? You can't outsource that, and that is one of those things where I think you can end up being isolated. But it also means that it's really important to build your knowledge base in times of non-crisis, right? Talk to people about police murders before it happens, before you need to speak publicly about it, right? Go and seek those opportunities out. That's something that I think a leader needs to do on the off days, right? Over dinner, over a drink or whatever. Okay, one last thing, and I don't want to spend too much. We're right in the middle of the Title IX crisis here in Louisiana with LSU, and it is, talk about an emotional crisis. We're listening to testimony from women that have been abused, not heard, ground down by a bureaucratic system that constantly asks them to do things that they don't want to relive. It is something where nobody who's in leadership right now is directly involved. But if you are in a position where you're leading a group and things like of these kinds of institutional levels come out, you really need to ask, what am I willing to give up? Am I willing to quit? And I mean that in the sense, step down. And this actually came up with our state legislator yesterday, where some of them are really trying to get our president to say, you need to fire people, or you need to fire yourself. And I'm not saying he should, but I am saying that your values are more important than your position. Your reputation is more important than your position. And you need to be able to say, if it's better for the victims, if it's better for the institution and the overall goal of what we're trying to do, take the hit, right? And even if you don't, you have to be willing to ask yourself that question and be open to saying yes, I will. And one last thing on that is that with these kinds of crises, that it's like public health, coming back full circle to the pandemic. It's like public health. Nobody will give you credit for preventing the next pandemic, right? And very few people will give you credit for being a stickler for Title IX rules. But that's the kind of thing, little things lead to big things. And part of being a leader, again, be that lonely aspect of it, that aspect of sort of being able to be out on your own on a decision. You need to be able to say, look, I hate to be a stickler, but you said it, I got to tell somebody, right? That's the way our systems work. And there's reasons why it works. And part of that is being able to explain it in credible ways. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. I've probably gone over what was allocated to me, but happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have clearly gone over the time, but however, you guys have great information. You're giving us great insight. We don't have any questions at this point, which means that everyone is enthralled with everything that you and Susan has said thus far. So I want to introduce our third speaker. I apologize, Dean Hamilton, if you were going to go second. Dawn actually lost connectivity, so that's why you had that pregnant pause on us trying to figure out what happens next. But please, Dean Hamilton, we would like to hear from you.
Sure. Thank you, Sheri. And thank you, Susan and Jim. I'm still kind of feeling that where you ended there, Jim. Just thinking about those women, it's really brings me back to such a deep present and the hardness of that. And it just puts me all back all over again to how this past year has just been such a series of presents. The presence of the day of the assault on the Capitol, the present of the day after the murder of George Floyd, and the present of the last day we were in our offices. And the past year, I've never improvised so much in my life, because these presents just come and come and come. And living in them, I couldn't even know where to start with talking about lessons learned yet, really. I think, and so thinking about this presentation and this opportunity, which I'm so grateful for, I just thought, well, maybe I'll take it as a chance to just reflect on a year of improvisation and how I might describe not the lessons yet, but some of the stages in that. So I'm going to talk a little bit less about operations and a little bit more about my relationship to leadership itself, and give you a little background about how I came to it and our context here at University of Illinois. I'm an artist, and it's my great gift to have a planning department in the college that I steward. Here at University of Illinois, we have this historic College of Fine and Applied Arts. I'm going into my 20th year as faculty member in this college. I come from an art background, largely in public art, community-based art practices, but also some work in drawing and abstract painting and things. And so improvisation is not so new to me. I've been so grateful to have a planning department in my college during this time. Not because my campus is listening to y'all's discipline as much as it should, but because the values are so certain among my colleagues in planning. And I'm so grateful to be able to rest into those and point to them. I'll describe, towards the end to hear my remarks, I'll describe, I think, my year of improvisation in terms of 3 stages of my testing postures of leadership. But let me just tell you a little bit more about how I got here. So one interesting thing about what found me in a dean's role, this is my third year as a dean, is that I wasn't looking for this role. At the time, I was a provost fellow trying out some different things about leadership. And my charge as a provost was to develop new campus policies and practices around the hosting of controversial guest speakers. I spent a year on this subject, talking to people around campus, investigating our processes that were available to there. So in a way, I was already getting deep into our crisis of democracy and the way that our campuses have been staging grounds for some time for some of the crises that have really come to a head in the past year. That already had me well prepared in certain ways for some of what was to come. I got moved out of that role, and before I even was able to complete the work, when our dean search failed, and our provost asked me to step into the role. And when I started into the role, my mind was in programs. My mind was in operations. I was imagining through my many years of being able to be at the right hand of various administrators and really having a privileged chance to learn that the key to taking on this role would be to get the right resources and the right programs and carry them out. That's an approach of someone who has more than 15 minutes to prepare for a meeting. That's the approach of someone who, had the privilege of spending maybe a day preparing the perfect meeting, right? That's what happens when you're in service roles as an aspiring leader instead of as a leader. I learned quickly, and especially in this past year, that leading has not been about programs and operations. It's been about rhetorics, ethos, habits. And that's where I've been living, is trying to notice which habits are in me now, which rhetorics are at work in me and in my colleagues now. And I've come to see that actually one of the greatest, most important capacities that I'm granted as a dean is not my capacity to say yes or no to things, but my capacity to convene. And that convening has been so important in the past year, virtually, in the present, asynchronously convening around values. I could talk all day about the amazing accomplishments in our college in the past year, and maybe we get to that in our discussions and breakouts. I've been saying all along that there's hardly a college I'd rather be in for these moments than an arts-based college. Our folks understand care, and they understand health, and they understand improvisation. So everybody asked me on campus, "Oh my God, you're a dean in a college that has performing arts in it. What are you all doing right now?" And it has been extremely hard. A lot of our folks missing the intrinsic rewards of their work, not being able to prepare things for the stage, not being able to be out there with our public partners. But the resiliency is just so strong. I mean, the arts folks have examples of how to do this. And I think we've really shown, I think we're going to continue to show just how important the arts broadly defined, the arts design, choreography are going to be to even our recovery. So our college is really well prepared for this in many ways, even though we were hard hit, and even though the industries we serve are decimated. In some ways, we are also, I think, very well prepared for the kind of culmination of so many outcries that happened with the mobilizations over the summer of the movement for Black Lives, and the incredible wave of new kind of authorizations in spaces we weren't used to seeing those authorizations to call out white supremacy. We were ready for that in certain ways, and that we've been talking about that in our college for a while, maybe a little too much talk. But at the same time, it also put us a little bit into some pitfalls we had to look out for, which were that I have learned in some ways I can share in more detail, maybe, that we were almost too quick to say what we were doing to dismantle white supremacy already, when actually we couldn't really say if it was doing something, right? We had all the rhetoric so ready to go in our work, and the way we changed, we'd already taken a different approach to which plays we perform, how we cast our plays. Many of our syllabi really reflecting deep faculty investigation about our content, but we weren't to then come out and say, well, we were already here for this. Thank God everybody else is here. We couldn't do that. We really didn't have enough to show for it yet. So we had to take some care. So at the same time, we were prepared for last summer, and maybe not as prepared as we should have been. A couple other things I should name about our context is that we are a STEM-heavy university, like some of the ones y'all are in, where our folks developed an incredible testing regime. We have had the benefit of a saliva-based testing regime for COVID that has been a marvel and has enabled safety for our employees, especially many of our most at-risk ones. On the flip side, we're in a university that really believes that STEM is all you need for some of this, right? And so it's sometimes the enthusiasm around the solution of the testing or the solution of the modeling behind that testing overreached what we were actually doing in terms of caretaking and paying attention to what was around us. And we are a predominantly white institution that has historically struggled to confront institutional racism in it as well. So as all this started to unfold, I mean, the past year, 3 questions were on my mind a lot that I wish had been covered in my orientation to administration. 1, how can I as a leader give people confidence to stand in the convictions that feel under assault? Right? I mean, when people look around and go, I don't see my university reflecting my values. How am I supposed to stand into them? I don't see the town I live in reflecting my values. How am I supposed to live into them? How am I as a leader supposed to give people confidence to that? Sometimes when it's even the folks above me in the chain that feel like their actions are not always supporting the convictions that my own faculty hold. Another question that's been on my mind for the past year is, how can I foment a care-based and a care-focused ethic in an institution that, like so many, is organized firstly around scarcity and risk management? How do I get care in there? That's been on my mind all the time. And most practically, all the time, what can I do to ameliorate an unjust burden that is planned out right in front of me? Like those 3 questions were not part of my orientation to being a dean, and I've been wrestling with them all year, thankfully not alone, with a great team and great colleagues. And I would describe my journey in this in 3 stages, just to kind of get to my point here and my end, which I'll sort of illuminate a little bit. And I think it's been a series of stages that is not unlike and not uncommensurate with the unlearning of whiteness itself, which is to stop making it so much about me and about who I am and more about the role. And my path has been one, really, even when I was looking at campus speech policies, I'm trying to find ways to kind of separate myself from the role at times, to navigate some of these tricky questions about how to speak to things that I didn't always know if I was authorized to speak to finding some ways to integrate that sometimes worked and sometimes not, to actually these days, I'm thinking a lot less about my personal place in the role than trying to be vigilant about what the role is trying to do through me. So stage 1 of this, I would call as like my beginning, was an understanding of the leader as a kind of authorizer. And I learned from a lot of great research that, for example, in faculty searches, you really do need that dean, that department head there saying, we need a diverse pool. And this search will not succeed unless it has a diverse pool. That's an authorization power that a dean has that I was really leaning into. And I started to think, well, how else can I use that authorization power? How else can I maybe even live by a different order than the one I see around me at times? How much power is in that? In the context of campus speech, one way I navigated that was when I moved into being a dean, I kept my personal Twitter account and I did not set up a separate dean Twitter account, because I wanted to be able to say if something went down, I wanted to be able to speak as myself over there and not have it be the same as my deanly speech. I still think that was a good move, but that separation of self from dean doesn't always play out so well. Stage 2 of my year of improvisation, I think, especially after May, was I began to sort of try to bring those things together and test out, like, well, what can I say? Maybe the dean, maybe the leader is not just an authorizer, but maybe the dean can actually speak things into being. Maybe the leader can declare things. Of course, we live in this era of statements. And I began to test out, like, what can I actually put in an official college statement that reflects my values and that I can kind of assume reflect a lot of my colleagues' values, and therefore authorize them and even say, well, no, actually, this is who we are. We are a college where Black Lives Matter. I began to test that out in my own deanly communications, but also began to see some negative effects of that, frankly, and maybe not ones you might think of, namely that what does it mean for the dean to say that in our college, Black Lives Matter, when we haven't put it into practice, when it's actually not in our policies, when it's actually not in our mission statement, when there's countless ways we can say that actually, if you look at what we do, these lives don't matter and how we're prioritizing things. And so I began to see where actually by my testing out the declarative power of a leader, I was actually potentially doing more damage by, in the interest of trying to authorize convictions of my colleagues, actually almost a kind of whitewashing here, a kind of saying, well, the dean says it's this, so it must be that. So I learned that that's, in one of my stages here, that's not really, I got to take some care there. And so to conclude, I think stage 3 is where I am now, moving from leader as authorizer to leader as kind of declarer in chief. I think the best way I describe it today is the leader as disoriented in a disoriented institution, because these institutions need to be reoriented. And the leadership role itself, white supremacy, has disoriented me in a way I have to reorient myself. And I have to reorient my role. And I need to look at how the history of the forms of the plantation, back to Clemson, I'm from Greenville, by Clemson, are working through me. Because the plantation's power is still working through us. So I've been looking really ever more at asking every moment, how is actually the deanship working through me through the worst of these forms of power? And how could I dismantle that in front of me? And I've begun a series of conversations with other leaders on campus. As other people are doing great work on policy right now, and we have so many good policy people in this room, I'm sure. I felt unique. I felt differently called to ask, how are leaders inhabiting their roles on this campus? And so right now I'm in a series of conversations with our top leaders, our provost, all the vice chancellors, and with a couple other folks. We're asking them a series of questions like, in what ways do you understand uprooting structural racism to be part of your job? What about your training prepared you to challenge structural racism in your work? I'm now talking with individual leaders about this so that we can try to change the way that leaders themselves are charged, the way they're trained, not just through diversity training or anti-racism training, but through developing habits of to see structural racism at work, to foment habits among ourselves for how we dismantle it together, and to change the ways we actually convene to that end. That is kind of where I am now. I'm learning, but I'm still improvising every day. So thank y'all for the chance to share. I'm looking forward to some discussion.
Thank you. Right now we have one question in the chat that's for all 3 of you. And I see that James has begun to answer, but I'll go ahead and read it out loud. And it's for all 3 of you. Have you found that any of the mostly traumatic events of the past year have generated any opportunities? If so, how have you used them? And Dean Hamilton, you've been addressing that. You've been addressing that question as you've been speaking, but definitely opening it up to the rest of our speakers.
I'm certainly happy to jump in here. Yes, there have been a lot of opportunities, and I will say even, silver linings that have come to bear. I am in a school that we focus on public administration and public policy, and so I'll start at the macro level. Just seeing a lot of the policies being implemented that before March 2020, we would have thought had no opportunity to be implemented. Some of those include direct payments and transfer payments to folks who are in poverty and who are economically struggling. The ability to have telework and to also have telehealth. I remember one of our capstone students, I went back and looked at it when I was teaching back in 2015. They did a project on telehealth and all the barriers to telehealth, and all those, barriers largely evaporated very, very quickly. The ability for members of our community who are disabled to be able to pick up their groceries and have the groceries put in their car for them. I mean, things that people had advocated for, the GRE score and standardized testing. How many years have we heard about how that disadvantages minority applicants? But no, we have to still hang on to it. All of a sudden they were gone, just in the blink of the eye. So a lot of the things that from an equity standpoint and public policy that we, people have worked years and years and years on to, make incremental progress, were just stripped away in the matter of a couple of weeks. And so I thought that provided a big opportunity now, as we come out of the pandemic, to think through how are we going to be reshaped, and what is going to last, and what things are we going to go back to. And so I think it's really an opportunity for us to see what is it that we want, for our students, for our faculty. What are some of the things, the generous policies about stopping the tenure clock or needing an extra year for situations that may have come up. Just all of these things, were magically shifted within a very short period of time. And those are tremendous opportunities for us to take advantage of and to think of structurally. How can we continue these structures, the ones that are working, and not go back to what we were? One of the analogies I like to use is, before the pandemic, I think about if you're baking a cake, you've got the egg out, you've got the butter out, you've got the flour out. The eggs being an egg, the butter's being butter, flour's being flour. They come together and they go through the experience of becoming a cake. And there's something completely different now. They can't go back to being an egg and to being a butter and to being flour. They are now mixed together. And that's what I think that has happened socially now. We have gone through such a big experience together. My concern is, when we're thinking about opportunities, is will we continue this opportunity structure moving forward in the future? And I'm very concerned about that, because before, I know, it was this, we're all in this together. We're all in this pandemic together. And again, oftentimes when emergencies happen, that's what we say. But then when we come out, it's a very different situation. And I'm concerned, even just thinking now, some of the reopening plans are really designed for the privileged. Those who have been able to telework, those who have been able to get vaccinated. We still have members of Black and Brown communities who are disproportionately being impacted by COVID, who are going to be in vulnerable situations. What messages are we sending to them? And so I think in the beginning, we saw in the pandemic that there were acceptable losses. And I think we're going to say, again, there are acceptable losses in some communities as we come out of the pandemic. And I think that's very, very unfortunate. We should not take the position that there are acceptable losses. So I think the biggest opportunity is an opportunity for us to continue to be the best, to embrace our humanitarian spirit, and to be and to try to invest as much as possible into making our colleagues, our students, and our faculty successful. And I hope that those things will continue.
Let me jump in here and sort of echo what Susan was saying. So Susan, you touched on a lot of the big things that I think are the opportunities, and what I would kind of reiterate is that higher education was not on a good pathway before the pandemic. You can read about it in any kind of the trade journals. There's huge problems with higher education. So everything that we were thinking about before the pandemic and before the other crises that coalesced the kind of momentum that I think, Susan, you were pointing to, those are things that are still important, right? And I think that it just accelerates all that stuff. And to the extent that you had some ideas about how your department or your college or your discipline should be changing, there's a critical mass of people thinking big now. And experience, for example, the teleworking and the online classes, right? We are now used to it, right? For better or worse. So what had been a whole bunch of cranky faculty that said, no way you could ever teach, Econ 101 online, you lose that. Well, they had to do it, and they either did it well or they didn't do it well, and they like some about it. That's water under the bridge. So it's a different part of the conversation now. But that value of does this serve our students? Does an online modality create a more equitable opportunity for our universities, right? In terms of who we serve? Those questions will remain. And so, but I do think that it's not forever, right? I think that this is a moment that's going up, and it's going to, right now you have presidents talking about white supremacy, right? That wouldn't have happened a year ago, at most places. And if there's one institution in the world that is the most white supremacist institution, it's the university. It's the European-based university by definition. We tend not to think of it in that way, but that's what that is, right? By very clear definition. So it's a very conservative institution. So it's not easy, but I think that the momentum is to do something different than what has been in the past. Anyway, I'll shut up there.
Yeah, I think even segueing here into Rolf's question there, and I see Raina's question too. This opportunity for how care might be able to get baked into our institutions right now is really interesting, and of course fraught. I mean, y'all all know, we all still write the emails. I hope this email finds you well. And every email comes out. I mean, we're trying to put wellness, we're trying to put forward. I'm doing it, we have a little kind of authorization to put care for each other in, and it's great. And now crack it's a little wider. Our new promotion tenure guidelines are modified to now have a section where you're invited to describe some of the effects of the pandemic on your progress. And they found a way to put it in there carefully that I think it's about adding context. Well, now, once you begin to invite some contextualization of how your different navigation of this season affected your progress, then can't that crack get a little bit wider to show, well, can we use that same kind of crack to say, how is the experience of navigating a predominantly white institution as the only the Black, Brown, or Indigenous person in your department affected your pathway? How can we begin to acknowledge that and in more substantive ways? And I think what I start to get really excited about is that I think we start seeing some opportunities here to show that when you put care forward, it actually costs the university less. And that is the big fear, right? Is that the risk management approach, the scarcity approach, is always about, you're talking about course releases now. We can't afford to give them all out. But I think actually if we start by trying to have our department heads really beginning to cultivate an awareness of where folks are and finding in a responsive way to say, no, it's in our interest to help you succeed. We need to find which way is to succeed. I don't think it's going to cost what the university thinks it's going to cost to enact that care if it's in that responsive way. If we could have some examples from all this to show for that, that would be a huge gain in this time.
Well, Kevin, you've done great moderating, being able to catch Rolf's questions as well as Raina's. James, Susan, do you want to add to that?
I will add that I think this, I talked about some of the crises that we're going through right now at LSU, and everybody talks about the culture, right? It's the culture of, covering things up and and I do agree with that, but I think that the question about care is more direct as a solution-oriented way of describing it. Because I do think that the culture is it's more of an uncaring bureaucracy. That's the biggest problem, right? There is risk, right? There's legal, there's laws, and there's FERPA, there's all sorts of things where you have to manage risk, and that's the lawyer's job. That's, tend not to be lawyers, and so we kind of put that over into legal counsel. On the other hand, we have a whole set of rules that we have to follow, especially when you're an administrator. There's financial, rules. There's, email transparency. And this is one of those things I was going to talk a bit about in my comments, but didn't. When I first came here, I kind of came on the tail end of the George Floyd kind of discussion on campus, or virtually on campus, and inherited the discussion that the graduate school was having with the Black Graduate and Professional Students Association. It sort of kind of came in as, sort of the dean to kind of manage what was going on. And I looked at the track record of the engagements, and on the surface there was, we support you, but then there were all these qualifiers below it, right? But if we give money to the Black Graduate Student Association, then we have to treat every other group fairly, and And I get it, you're trying to control how people perceive it, but that's not the moment for bringing those things up, right? And I think what we were talking about earlier is that when we focus on the risk aversion or risk management, which is super important, and the lawyers, we outsource it to the lawyers, we need to treat people with respect and with humanity, right? And not sort of say, yes, I agree with you, but all lives matter, right? You know, and that's the feeling that I get with many of the communications, not just here at LSU, but in some of the other institutions I've been in. And I think that that's a big problem, and it's easy to fix. It's very easy to fix.
Well, thank you. We actually are right on time. For our audience and for our speakers, this is the point where we're going to break out into breakout sessions. And you actually have the opportunity to select your own based on which of our guests you would like to talk with. You also have the flexibility to pop out of one and pop out into another without us having to manually put you from one to the other. And so we will move our guests into their own unique breakout rooms. And then you as our guest, we ask you to by all means jump in, ask your questions. We'll be in each of the rooms to assist with moderating if necessary, but it seems as though our guests they know exactly what they're doing and they can manage their own rooms. And so we'll definitely be there if our assistance is needed. But please go ahead, Donna, work your magic, and we will enjoy the rest of your session. You will not come here after it's done. We invite you to go to the networking room and continue your conversations after. Thank you again. I will say on behalf of Don and Rania, thank you for joining us this evening, and enjoy the rest of this session.